White initiates with a solid central pawn push, establishing central control. The evaluation remains balanced. Black mirrors White's central intent, maintaining dynamic balance. Development continues soundly. White expands on the queenside, solidifying pawn structure. Equality is maintained. Black fianchettos the bishop, aiming for hypermodern central control. The position is stable. White develops the knight to a natural square, reinforcing central influence. Balance persists. The move the bishop to g7 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d5, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the knight to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to g7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on d5 executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White pushes a central pawn, creating a strong pawn center. White's advantage is consolidated. Black shores up the pawn structure, maintaining the balance. White's advantage remains. White develops the other knight, preparing for kingside castling. White's advantage is stable. Black castles kingside, securing the king. White's advantage is still present. White develops the bishop, aiming for an active square. White's positional edge is maintained. Black pushes a pawn aggressively, challenging the center. The position remains complex. White castles kingside, consolidating king safety and activating the rook. White's advantage grows. The move the pawn to c6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to e1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight on the b-file to d7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to h3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White centralizes a rook, eyeing the open file. White's advantage is stable. Black exchanges pawns in the center, simplifying slightly. White's advantage persists. White recaptures with the knight, maintaining central control. White's advantage holds. Black repositions a rook, improving its activity. White's slight advantage is retained. White activates the bishop, preparing for potential kingside play. White's positional edge is clear. Black advances a knight aggressively, creating tactical possibilities. White's advantage is stable. White plays a prophylactic move, preventing immediate threats. White's advantage is unchanged. Black centralizes the queen, increasing pressure. White's advantage remains. White captures a pawn, simplifying the position. White's advantage is solid. Black recaptures the pawn, maintaining material equality. White's advantage is consistent. White advances a pawn, expanding space on the kingside. White's advantage is firm. Black repositions the knight, seeking better activity. White's advantage persists. The move the bishop to f4 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to e3, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Afterwards, the queen takes on d1 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook on the f-file takes on d1, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to e5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to f4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on c3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black exchanges queens, simplifying into a favorable endgame. Black maintains equality. White recaptures with the rook, centralizing it. White's advantage is maintained. Black repositions the bishop to a central square. White's slight advantage persists. White repositions the bishop, improving its scope. White's advantage is stable. Black advances the knight, challenging White's pieces. White's advantage is clear. White advances a pawn, solidifying the center. White's advantage is maintained. Black places the bishop on an active square. White's advantage is consistent. The move the rook to c1 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to d2, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to a5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook on the e file to d1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to a3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to b3, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black expands on the queenside, creating counterplay. Equality is maintained. White repositions the rook, maintaining pressure. The position is balanced. Black advances a pawn, asserting presence on the queenside. Equality is preserved. The move the pawn to a3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to d1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the knight to a6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to f4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on c3, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on c3 executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to c5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the rook to the open file. Equality is maintained. White centralizes the rook, contesting the file. Equality is maintained. The move the pawn to h6 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to d8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the knight to e2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the g file takes on f6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the bishop takes on f6 executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook to d1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the pawn, gaining material. White's advantage is clear. The move the pawn to f5 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to h7, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to d8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook on the b file to d1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to b3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to c2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances the pawn, creating a strong passed pawn. White's advantage is substantial. Black repositions the bishop, attempting to control squares. White's advantage remains strong. The move the pawn to e5 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to d1, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the bishop takes on c3 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the b file takes on c3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. unlocking the bishop to d3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to f6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the bishop, improving its defensive post. White's advantage persists. The move the pawn on the e-file takes on d6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on c5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the pawn on the d-file takes on c5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the king to f2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to d1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with the bishop, maintaining piece activity. White's advantage is clear. White centralizes the rook, increasing pressure on the d-file. White's advantage is solid. The move the bishop to f8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to e7, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the knight to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the knight to f6 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the king to f7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to h7, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances the knight, creating threats. White's advantage is significant. Black repositions the rook, defending key squares. White's advantage is still present. White checks the king with the knight, forcing king movement. White's advantage is clear. The move the king to f7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to h8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to e1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on f6 executes a favorable trade, continuing with the bishop takes on c5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White captures the rook, simplifying to a winning endgame. White's advantage is overwhelming. The move the rook takes on d8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to c8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to h7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the rook takes on d8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to h8 promoting to queen secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e7 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the queen to h7 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. White moves the knight, initiating an attack. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black centralizes the knight, seeking counterplay. White's decisive advantage is maintained. White checks the king with the knight, forcing further king retreat. White's advantage is overwhelming. The move the king to f6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight takes on g5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on g5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the king to g8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to h7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances a pawn, creating a powerful passed pawn. White's advantage is overwhelming. The move the rook to d1 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight takes on g5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on g5 with check executes a favorable trade, which enables the king to f7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the g-file takes on f5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the knight takes on e4 with check by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to c1, activating the rook on an open file. Afterwards, the rook takes on c1 executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to h7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to g7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, allowing the bishop to d4 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. This allows the king to e7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn on the f-file takes on e4 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to e7, claiming key space in the center, allowing the bishop to c5 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the king to e8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to h7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to g7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White advances the pawn, creating a protected passed pawn. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black moves the king, seeking safety. White's decisive advantage is maintained. White repositions the king, centralizing for the endgame. White's advantage is overwhelming. The move the rook to d7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to b6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on b6, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to e7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to g2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the rook, preparing to escort the passed pawn. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black exchanges rooks, simplifying but unable to escape. White's advantage remains decisive. White recaptures with the bishop, consolidating the advantage. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black checks with the bishop, a solid defensive move. White's advantage is crushing. White moves the bishop, blocking the check and reinforcing. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black repositions the bishop, seeking better squares. White's advantage is crushing. White moves the bishop, improving its post. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black repositions the king, a solid defensive attempt. White's advantage is crushing. White centralizes the king, supporting the passed pawn. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black repositions the bishop, aiming for activity. White's overwhelming advantage is maintained. White advances a pawn, creating further pressure. White's advantage is overwhelming. The move the bishop to c7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to b8, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the bishop to g2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to h7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to c7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the bishop, maintaining control. White's advantage is overwhelming. Black repositions the bishop to a better square. White's overwhelming advantage is maintained. White captures a pawn, securing a decisive material advantage. White's position is winning. Black repositions the bishop, a solid last move. White's advantage remains overwhelming. White captures another pawn, sealing the victory. White has an overwhelming winning advantage.